Hi there everyone, Steve the Amateur Historian here with another story that as I have discussed, is somewhat following a series of this string of very terrible murders that predominantly came out of the Salem area back in the 1970s and 1980s. There's a lot of stories in that time period, and they're all just horrendously tragic and representative of a time where crime all across America was at its peak. And this particular video is going to delve into the murders of two young girls, one of whom was from the Salem area, the other whom was from Corvallis, which is not too far from Salem. And these were two murders that occurred presumably only 4 days apart during the spring of 1978.
Historian.
So we begin April 15th, 1978. In Corvallis, Oregon, there is a March of Dimes walk-a-thon going on, and a bunch of local school kids are directly involved in this event. And one of these kids is 12-year-old Ann Ellinwood, who is, as the story goes, for the most part, she's walking, doing her laps like anybody else, walking around with a small group of friends. But roughly around 1 p.m. that day, she began to complain of some soreness, some discomfort in one of her feet, and I don't know if her objective was that she was just going to stop there because she was in pain or what exactly, but it seems like she bowed out of the walk-a-thon while her friends continued going, so there was a separation that occurred there. And Anne started walking off from the park. She was seen in the vicinity of Southwest 1st Street in Corvallis, which is right along the fringe of the park that they were doing the walk-a-thon in. And that would be the last time that Ann Ellinwood would ever be seen alive, just a little after 1 p.m., April 15th, 1978. So, as would become a fairly common reoccurring theme in the Salem, in this case Corvallis area, which again the two places are very close to each other, a young girl vanishes and everybody's put on watch. It seems like every year, every couple of years, there's some 10, 12-year-old girl missing, or even like a 16, 17-year-old girl that goes missing in this area. And 1978, in the Salem area, they actually solved a case that I talk about in a video about a woman named Kathy Owens, who was only 25, I believe, when she was murdered back in 1971. And her case remained a cold case till 1978. And here we have that same year, right around the same time, this 12-year-old girl vanishes from a walk-a-thon in Corvallis. We then fast forward to 4 days later. It is April 19th, 1978. And another young girl, Stephanie Newsom, who I believe she was 11 years old. So her and Ann were very close in age, but she was slightly younger. And she lived in Salem, Oregon, just kind of towards the western part of Salem. And roughly around 4:30 p.m. that day, she leaves her home and doesn't make it that far, doesn't make it but a block or two, it seems, before she suddenly vanishes, just like Ann Ellinwood. And now, in the span of less than 100 hours, we have two girls in somewhat close proximity of one another who have vanished into thin air. So if Ann Ellinwood's disappearance had people panicked, the disappearance of Stephanie Ann Newsom is only exacerbated that fear and panic. And of course you have parents who are now, if their kids lived close to their school, they would let their kids go to the school by themselves. They're walking their kids to school, they're driving their kids to school. Mom, can I go to the corner and get something to eat? No, I'm going to accompany you to the corner store so that I have my eyes on you every single second that you are alive, really, at this point. So this becomes a time of great fear and panic and turmoil in the Salem, Corvallis area. And what's very, very interesting about this whole case is that I don't know if this was a correlation between their killing. It's just a very interesting thing that happened, especially for two people that lived in different towns. In the case of Ann Ellinwood, after this walk-a-thon was over, she was supposed to go to work doing her job as a paper delivery person, which of course if you're under the legal working age, that's about the only job you can get besides mowing lawns is delivering papers. So that's what Ann Ellinwood was supposed to be doing right after this March of Dimes walk-a-thon where she vanishes. When Stephanie Ann Newsom left her house 4 days later, she was leaving because she was going out to do her job, which was going around and handing out supplements for a newspaper. So they were both of these two girls that disappeared, when they disappeared, they were both on the almost precipice of going out to do a newspaper-style delivery job. I saw that and I thought that was really strange. I don't think it has any correlation in terms of like the person who was responsible for their abduction. They were looking for girls that were newspaper delivery people. I don't think that was the case, but it's a time of great panic, and that panic is further exacerbated because neither of these girls were the runaway type. It was even the authorities immediately knew these girls vanished, and it was likely through nefarious means of some kind. These were not girls that just ran off. And 8 days after she vanishes, it's April 27th, 1978, the body of Stephanie Ann Newsom is discovered. At this point, Ann Ellinwood's body has not been found. And Stephanie Ann Newsom was found in a somewhat rural area, a good distance away from Salem. And her body had just been deposited in a field, essentially, in what was known as the Ankeny National Wildlife Refuge, I believe. And she was just kind of deposited. Actually, she wasn't very well hidden. And she was discovered pretty quickly by a farmer who was working the land and was able to uncover her body pretty quickly. And it was pretty obvious that she had died as the result of homicidal violence of some kind. So when that happens, you have to wonder what happened to Ann Ellinwood. And now immediately after these two girls go missing, there's very little to go on. The police don't really have any clue what happened. These just seem to be two girls that just disappeared into thin air. However, in the case of Stephanie Ann Newsom, and this may be the result that she was so close to a middle school, she lived right through a little forested stretch from her middle school, maybe a couple 100 feet away. And when you have a middle school, even if school's not currently going on, because this is later in the afternoon, there's going to be kids around. And there was a kid, a school student specifically in the area, and as this school student said, they, while they were in the vicinity of the school, they saw a man grab a girl. No specific mention if it was Stephanie Ann Newsom, but a man was seen grabbing a girl, and this man was described as being in his late 20s to around 30, 5'8", stocky, light brown hair just below ear length. So maybe just, a little bit, because here's the base of my ear, so just slightly shorter than my hair. So, somewhat long, a little bushy. And he was described as driving a dirty white car, perhaps something similar to a 1965 Chevrolet Bel Air. And it is believed that this child, the time and the place, had witnessed the abduction of Stephanie Ann Newsom. And it was a pretty brazen abduction. She was just grabbed and thrown into a car, seemingly only a short distance from her home. but at least we have something resembling a description of someone to potentially look out for. But as time passed, there was another eyewitness account that came out in relation to Ann Ellinwood. Now, this was not the same type of description, whereas in this case we have a student who actually sees the child in the moment of being abducted. In this case, this was another young kid who didn't see Ann Ellinwood get abducted, but the description that this child gave about this strange man that she encountered, a man who, just based on his behavioral pattern, seems to be someone who maybe has pedophilic tendencies, someone who might have an interest in grabbing or abducting a young girl. So it's in the vicinity of the park. It's right next to where Ann Ellinwood is last seen. A young girl comes forward and makes mention, maybe it's something, maybe it's nothing, but she makes mention of an encounter she had with a man who somewhat matched a description that was given by this other child who saw Stephanie Newsom get abducted. This person said that this man that she encountered, the day that Ann Ellinwood vanished, in the vicinity of where she vanished, this girl said, I believe it was a young girl, said that she had this encounter with this man who had a small dog. She remembered that specifically, this man had a small dog. He apparently asked her to hold on to the dog while he did something, and it's a wonder if maybe this guy was trying to abduct this kid or something, but we know that this individual had a small dog. The child also stated that this man drove a red truck with a bed, or a cover over the bed. I forget what it's called right now. But no, he drove a red truck that had a trailer over its bed, which would be a perfect spot to open up and hide someone in. So, in the case of Ann Ellinwood, this is the only thing they really have to go on, is we have a man, he seems to maybe, match closely to the person who took Stephanie Newsom. It's a guy that he had a mustache, he had hair that was just a little below ear length, and again, we know he has a red truck with a trailer on it, and he has a small dog. Well, it's not much to go on, but it's all authorities have to go on. So they start putting the information out. Has anybody seen a man matching this description who has a vehicle like this? And a little ways east of the Salem Corvallis area, there's a small town called Lebanon, and near that there's a town called Sweet Home. And there's been mixed information about what town it actually occurred in. They're right next to each other, and their personal opinion, the very, very sketchy towns. Almost like, Salem in the 80s. There's been a lot of strange crimes, strange murders that have come out of that area. I know from personal experience, when I ran cross country in high school, we had an invite that was called the Sweet Home Invitational. And we were at a park right next to Sweet Home, and after our race was done, we went down by, I don't know if it was a river or a creek bed that was right along the park, and while we were hanging out on the beach, we found a shotgun that somebody left there. Literally, we're just a couple of 15, 16, 17-year-old kids just walking around on the beach after a cross-country race next to a park that's full of young people, and there's just a shotgun sitting there. And I feel like that's pretty apropos representation, kind of what Lebanon and Sweet Home is like. But for the sake of our story, a witness drops a tip to the police saying that there's a guy who matches the description pretty well that's been given of this person who may have grabbed these two girls, and he also just happened to drive a red truck with, I believe, a white kind of little trailer on the back. And again, not much to go on, but the police have to cover all of their any lead they have. And this is where a man named Earl Chambers comes into the picture. He is this man that lives in, I believe it was Lebanon was the actual town he lived in, even though newspapers reported him as living in both Lebanon and Sweet Home. And he worked as a roofer, I believe. I want to say he was roughly about 40 years of age. So, the description of who took Stephanie Newsom, they said it was more late 20s, but it was a kid, You know, there's some leeway there. And as authorities start looking into Earl Chambers, they notice some interesting things about his appearance. There's actually a picture of him where he's got long hair that's kind of just below his ear, and he's got a mustache. It almost kind of makes him look younger than he really was. He's sitting in a truck, like in the driver's seat, and he's holding a little dog in his hand. So you've got a truck, you've got the hair, you've got a little dog, and all of a sudden this guy's becoming very interesting to authorities, and authorities show up on the scene, and they want to search his truck and, you know, the back truck bed where he could have stuck a child. If he could have grabbed a child and stuck him back there quick, sped off out of town, nobody would have known anything. And while authorities search his truck, they find hair identical to Ann Ellinwood's hair. Now, this is not, you know, DNA evidence. This is not a fingerprint. But it's very suspicious, and it definitely casts more light on him. And authorities are becoming pretty quickly convinced that this guy is the killer. And it's just a matter of time and a matter of gathering more evidence. And there was actually a near abduction of another little girl way up in Gresham, which is just east side of Portland. So this is about 40-50 miles away from Salem even, where there was a girl that was even younger than Ann Ellinwood and Stephanie Newsom who was assaulted and almost killed and managed to escape. And once Earl Chambers came under the attention of authorities, they considered the possibility that maybe he was the guilty party in that too. But they had a surviving victim, and they actually they took Earl Chambers to Gresham for this girl to look at in a lineup, which they also did with this girl who encountered this guy with the little dog in the red truck in Corvallis the day that Ann Ellinwood disappeared. And I believe that child wasn't able to identify Chambers, and the girl that was attacked in Gresham, which, personal opinion, I don't think this Gresham assault was connected. I don't think Chambers was guilty of that at all, and the girl said as much. But what's interesting is it seems within days of Ann Ellinwood and Stephanie Newsom going missing, Earl Chambers, who's got, in the pictures you see, he's got this long blonde hair just below the ears and the mustache. And, he looks like a guy that likes working on cars and drinking beer. You know, it's the 1970s. A lot of guys look like that. Right after these two girls disappear, he cuts all his hair off, shaves his mustache. He doesn't remotely look like the same person. He looks like a completely different guy. If I saw the guy with the long hair and the mustache commit a crime, I stood and watched him do it right in front of me, especially if he had like sunglasses on or anything else like that. And then the guy cut all his hair off and he looked like how Earl Chambers did after he cut all his hair off. I probably wouldn't have been able to identify him as the guy. Even if I watched him commit a crime right in front of me, he looked that remarkably different. It was almost a Ted Bundy-esque type thing, how he constantly changed his appearance. And it threw off people who went to lineups to try to identify him. But this is specifically June 5th, 1978, that Chambers is run up to Gresham and put into this lineup. And while he's in there in this lineup, the authorities are checking his car for more evidence. So he's got a lot of heat on him, and he's apparently becoming very unhinged by what's going on, and he should be. Because while he's in there at this lineup, the authorities search his car. This isn't even his truck, this is another vehicle he owns, and they find more hair that matches Ann Ellinwood's hair perfectly. We now have hair matching her perfectly in two different vehicles he owns, which again is not dead set evidence. You can't convict him just based on that information, but there was so much more. There was another witness came out who said they actually saw him conferring with Ann Ellinwood directly, and they got the impression that he was trying to convince her that he was a police officer, which makes you wonder. I mean, lots of serial killers use that. The Hillside Stranglers down in LA, that's what they would do. They would convince a lot of young women that they were police officers. And especially when you're dealing with a young child, if you tell a child that you're an officer of the law, and hey, let me give you a ride home, hey, let me help you out, oh, your foot's hurting, let me help you, a child's gonna have a tendency to trust that person. So it's very possible that if Chambers was the guy, that may have been how he got Ann Ellinwood and how he was able to get her without drawing any attention. He could have literally coerced her into his vehicle and she would have thought nothing else about it. It would also come out, a friend of Chambers would come out and say that he admitted to being in that area, literally right by the park that the walk-a-thon was going in. So it's not looking good for this guy at all. And as would become a pretty telling little piece of information when Earl Chambers', I think it was his ex-wife, was talked to about him, trying to get information about what was this guy like, is he someone that's capable of this? And Chambers did have a criminal record that included assault. But when authorities talked to his ex-wife, she said words to the effect that he would rather die than end up in prison. And it seems like he's pretty close to ending up in prison at this point, if they can put these two murders on him. Being taken before the lineup in Gresham, and the police checking his car and finding more hair that could possibly be Ann Ellinwood's. This again is June 5th, 1978. June 6th, 1978. Earl Chambers suddenly vanishes. And he's discovered on a logging road not too far from the Lebanon Sweet Home area. And he is dead. He has committed suicide. Based on how he was discovered in his car on this kind of, back road, authorities determined that he likely tried to asphyxiate himself but couldn't quite do it, so he used the old method of funneling car exhaust into his car and poisoning himself that way. So this created a lot of problems for this case because they had not really fully tied him to this. There was a lot of reasons, a lot of circumstantial evidence that said, hey, Earl Chambers abducted and killed these two girls, presumably killed these two girls because, again, Stephanie Newsom was found 8 days after she vanished. I'll tell you right now, Ann Ellinwood, even to this day, 2019, her remains have never been found. But I think it can be presumed at this point that they were both killed and not too long after they disappeared. But you still have all this attention on Earl Chambers, and it's easy to say, now the guy can't defend himself. It's easy to say, all right, it sucks he killed himself, but we know he did it, so there, case closed, let's go on with our lives. First of all, I don't think the families of these two girls would be so keen to just go along with something like that without there being something very definitive, because if they are wrong, and there's a potential they could be wrong, that means there might be somebody else out there, which not only means that Ann Ellinwood and Stephanie Newsom are not getting real true justice for what they experienced as little girls, but that means there's still potentially a killer out there waiting to grab their next victim. And on the flip side, pretty much everybody who knew Earl Chambers came out and said, oh, he didn't do it, and the reason he committed suicide wasn't out of guilt or the sense that he was going to get caught, and as he apparently said, I'd rather die than go to prison. His friends would come out and say that he was 100% innocent, and the reason he killed himself was because he was overwhelmed and crushed by all the attention and suspicion that was being put on him for these murders, and he felt that it was inevitable that he was going to take the fall for it. And I personally, it's very, very hard for me, just based on this information I've given, to not think that this guy's the killer. He had a record, he matched perfectly down to the little dog in his hands and the vehicle he drove, the description given of him by this child he encountered in the park right where Ann Ellinwood disappeared the day she disappeared. How do that many coincidences happen and there's not fire from that smoke? And then in the case of Stephanie Newsom, she's seen by a child getting thrown into a 1960s white car. Well, it's known that Earl Chambers, the car that he drove that wasn't his truck, was a white late 60s model vehicle that somewhat matched with what the child said he saw this girl getting thrown into a car in the vicinity of where Stephanie Newsom vanishes. Again, you have all these all these coincidences that fall into line, and both of them tie back to Earl Chambers. And then on top of that, the guy commits suicide. It's very hard for me to think that this isn't all interconnected. But it's not the end of the story. One particular thing of suspicion that actually suggests it doesn't get Chambers at all off the hook for the Ann Ellinwood murder. And even then, to this day, like, we can presume she's murdered, but we don't have a body, we don't have full proof. But this was a crime that happened over 40 years ago, and she hasn't been seen since. But in the case of Stephanie Ann Newsom, who, again, her body was recovered, semen, I hate to talk about this stuff in relation to a young child, but this is how graphic some of these murders get. Stephanie Ann Newsom was found with semen close by, and it was thought that she was likely assaulted to some degree before she was killed. It came out. Now, again, I don't know how definitive this is. I only saw this in one report on the case. But reportedly, before these two girls went missing, Earl Chambers had a vasectomy, which I guess would affect, the idea that he could produce semen at the crime scene. Or, maybe it changes people's perspectives on him as assaulting this victim and then killing her. So that's put suspicion elsewhere. I don't think it at all gets him completely off the hook. But of course, as with so many other cases, because again, even though the authorities were really close with Earl Chambers killing himself, they couldn't fully close the case. So technically, the cases of Ann Ellinwood and Stephanie Ann Newsom became cold cases. And so then, of course, years and years later, when all these cases that weren't fully closed came about, as DNA evidence is getting stronger, the science, everything is getting stronger, and cold case squads are being established, and cold cases of all sorts are being reviewed over and over again, the case of these two missing girls came up. And I did notice, again, only in one article, after it came out that Chambers had a vasectomy, and to some people that was like, all right, he didn't kill Stephanie Ann Newsom, had to be somebody else. There was another specific person that was referenced as possibly being her killer, and it's a guy I found no further information on, so I don't really know what to go on. But in an article I read, after Chambers, this analysis that determined he'd had a vasectomy, so maybe he didn't kill Stephanie Ann Newsom, during the 1990s, there was another possible suspect named Manuel Trinidad Cortez, who was serving time for the brutal murder of two 11-year-old girls in Ashland, Oregon, which is probably 225 to 250 miles away from Salem, Corvallis area. But I mean, you have a guy who the very following year kills two victims of roughly the same age. I can see where that suspicion comes from. I don't know if there's any evidence that puts this guy in Salem or Corvallis during April 1978. He's just another name that I noticed came up, so I felt like it was my duty to reference it. But even in just recent years, the last 5 to 10 years, people who are still investigating the case are pretty certain, they're dead certain that Earl Chambers was the man who abducted and killed Ann Ellinwood, and they're all pretty convinced that he was responsible for Stephanie Ann Newsom. You have a victim of about the same age, just one town over, it's only a couple of days later, is kind of abducted, perhaps under similar circumstances. Both cases, you have vehicles that match the two vehicles that Earl Chambers is known to have had. Again, all these circumstances put together really still cast light on this guy that took his own life only a couple months after, presumably, he attacked and killed these girls. So that's where we're really at today. Most cold case investigators of all sorts on this case, are convinced as of today that Earl Chambers was guilty of the murder based on the evidence that we have to go on. But before I go, referencing this again was something I found in one particular article. And this was a piece of information that, as far as I know, was kind of kept under wraps for many years. But back in 1978, there were two Salem-based lawyers who said that they were contacted in the immediate aftermath, pretty much, of these girls going missing, and the heat had started falling on Earl Chambers. And these two Salem-based lawyers were contacted by Earl Chambers. And as I've taken it down, they had requested, this is after Chambers died, and they had conferred with him. He wanted these guys to be his defense team. So he's already, calling up lawyers, which is suspicious, to help defend them. And they sat down and they spoke. But, what they talked about was, attorney-client privilege. You can't just come out and say it, no matter how explosive or important the information is. And they actually asked for permission to give the information that Earl Chambers gave to them back in 1978, to reveal that information to help in the case. And they said specifically that what they knew based on their conversations with Earl Chambers was such explosive information that it would have required a grand jury to convene almost immediately. And another witness, or one of the attorneys, sorry, I guess they kind of count as witnesses, told cold case investigators that based on what they knew and what Chambers had said, that he was 100% responsible for the murder of Ann Ellinwood. But when they asked for permission to reveal this information, they were denied, and thus they were not allowed to reveal what they knew about the disappearances of these two girls. I'm sorry, sometimes, pardon my language, you need to tell the law to suck it, especially when it's going to help a couple of young girls who both vanished. And the guy in question, it's not like he was going to get a prison sentence for it at that point. He was dead. But even then, these attorneys who spoke to him directly were not allowed to reveal what they knew. And as far as I know, to this day, we don't know. Hopefully, maybe they've written it down somewhere and will reveal it before they die. I don't know. But it just adds more fuel to the fire, the idea that Earl Chambers, this guy from Lebanon Sweet Home area just east of Corvallis and Salem, was responsible for the disappearance and murders of 12-year-old Ann Ellinwood and 11-year-old Stephanie Newsom back in April 1978. And that's the case. Another horrible, tragic one from, again, this era, 1970s, 1980s, in the general Salem area. And all that said, thank you, as always, so much for watching this video. I put a lot of time and research into these, and it's always nice to know that people are watching them and to, gain insight into these cases that are more or less kind of forgotten and left in the past and really do deserve at least a little bit of attention, because what happened back then can still to this day be helpful in society now, in society in the future, in terms of knowing how to protect your children and knowing how to spot the signs of people who are suspicious, people who could potentially be harmful to your children, because all it takes is a few seconds for my children, your children, anyone's children to vanish forever, never to be seen alive again. So that's why I do a lot of videos like this. This stuff is very, very important to me. And all that said, guys, again, thank you so much for watching. Remember to like, share, subscribe, content for my channel. If you want to help me grow, I really appreciate it. And if you want to help me grow even more, you can hit up my Patreon page at www.patreon.com/ExploreOregon, all one word. If you want to help me financially, thanks in advance. I really appreciate it. And till next time, this has been Steve, the Amateur Historian.